Before starting, I also have to mention something. NG Vikings, like our cool friends from the very northern part of Europe, are again organizing their awesome conference, NG Vikings. As you maybe know, they're a traveling conference. So last year was in Helsinki, it was really cool. This year is in Copenhagen, it's on 27th, 28th of May. They also have the call for papers open till end of January, I guess. So if you're interested, definitely submit your talk and go and speak there. Yeah, see. All right, so who am I? As Michael said, I'm Jure Stumpflohner. I'm a Google developer expert in web technologies, specifically Angular, or mostly focused on Angular. I'm coming from Italy. Actually, it's a very northern part of Italy, so we speak German there. It's a very similar dialect as here in Austria, so I perfectly understand everyone here. I'm working there at a local company called R3GIS. We do web development with Angular on the mobile part and with geographic information systems. On the side, I'm also a trainer and consultant, doing mostly on-site workshops, speaking at conferences or meetups like this one here. And I'm also an NetHead.io instructor. These are some of the courses which are already out there. A bit of a spoiler, next week probably should be a new course that should be released from me, which is about web components, which Manfred talked about. So with Angular elements and that kind of stuff, it's more an introductory course. So definitely keep an eye on my Twitter handle or on Egghead when it will be released. And these are the places basically where you can find me online. Now I'm gonna speak today to you about forms. Now forms are probably the least interesting part in applications, right? Like I don't really like to develop them, but still if we create large business applications, there are a lot of forms. And they can also be quite complex usually. And so, as you probably know, we have two types of forms in Angular. We have those template-driven forms and the model-driven forms. They are also more popular with the name reactive forms. And so how can we distinguish them? Well, the template-driven forms, just very quickly, because probably you know it already, these are those with that ng model on them. You write them in HTML. You can also do some kind of validation directly in HTML. So this is really, really simplified, of course. And then we have people that tell you, well, you shouldn't really use the model, the template-driven forms. Like you should go more the reactive way, right? Why is that? Well, because reactive forms are usually more powerful. And to recap, reactive forms are created on the component class side. So we don't start on the template side, we start at the component side, we define our template, our model, how it should be structured and what we want to data bind. But then of course we also have to go to the HTML part again, because we somehow have to connect that model which we built, which might be nice and clean, to our HTML controls where the user actually interacts with them. And so I was curious, and back in July last year I created a poll which had quite some responses, about 700 of them. What do you actually use? You use more the template driven or the reactive forms? And so people said, well, reactive forms all the way. There's less magic involved, you see exactly what you have to do, and it's much more clear. Also business logic, which is complex, is hard to handle with the template-driven approach. It's easier with the reactive approach. John Pablo responded, he's more like, well, more towards the reactive approach, but he can totally understand that people have a hard time initially when they get into Angular to understand the reactive approach. Because there are two concepts, right? There's the whole form part, but there's also the reactive nature of how you build the forms. And well, Olivier said, well, depending on simple forms, more template-driven, reactive, complex forms, more reactive, and that's probably the one we all think about. It's probably, if you don't have to use them, just don't use them. But that's obviously not the reality. So my point is there's a lot of typing involved. Like I use reactive forms mostly because as for them, the things we just mentioned. But the problem is you have to type a lot and you have a lot of duplicate stuff there, because if you look, for instance, at that very simple form, we have the model part in this side, where, for instance, we define the name, the first name, the validations and stuff. But then on the template side, we have to do the exact same thing. Like in the HTML part, we also have to implement that. Now dynamic forms, like now you may say, well, it's already complex enough, why dynamic forms? Well, let me explain. With dynamic approach, I basically define different kind of levels of dynamicity. Like I have dynamic in the sense of you write some kind of configuration in the code and the HTML part is then generated somehow. So that's the kind of dynamic thing which will we focus today. And then there's obviously the full dynamic, where the server-side part exposes you how the form should be constructed, right? And then the form constructs by itself, basically. And in that second part, that's a use case which I see actually a lot and always more often, but then the server-side part has to play with it as well, right? You have to have the according data structures on the server side as well to support that kind of form generation coming directly from the server side. So that's what we would like to focus today. Like, you change your TypeScript code and you don't have to think about your HTML part over there. That's going to be generated automatically. So in theory, like if we have this reactive form, as in this case here, we could do it also by ourselves. Like, this is very simple. You see here just one input field with that form control name, first name. And then I have the code behind, like in my component. I create that form group, that model, just as you do in the normal reactive form approach, and that's it. But what I could do is actually go a step further and not only keep that form control name static as it was before. So if I switch back, you see here the first control name is just first name, it's a string. But I could actually bind it, right? So I could bind it to this field name, which now is somehow dynamic. So I could decide at runtime to which kind of property I would like to bind. And so in this way, you can already start imagining how I could start generating forms somehow dynamically, right? Based on my code side. So for instance, for such an object here, I could create this form control, this form group automatically by just iterating over the object's properties. I reduce it to a single configuration. I generate here the form controls, as you can see, with the property that I get from that object. I instantiate that form group, and then I pass it to my HTML. In the HTML, I just have to create that once. So I have here the properties, I loop over them. I have my input types here, and I bind them to my dynamic part, which I just generated, right? And we will get something like that. So very simple, and would already work. That's the output which you would get, like that's just the form value serialized, so we see that it matches what we want to get out of it. But what about the input type? Like, I just had an input type text here, right? It's very simple. Okay, I could start bind that as well, right? But then what about like select box? They have a different tag altogether, so I would have to change that as well. You see, it starts to continue and it doesn't get that easy. For simple use case that works, I create actually an NCAD course which I walk through this kind of thing, like also how to add validation and to build your own kind of mini framework for doing that. And it's suggested for simple approaches. But then when things get more complicated, like complicated validations, then maybe depending fields which connect with each other, like hiding fields, showing fields, it gets messy. And so therefore, I want to focus on something today which is called Angular Formally. Like, does someone maybe recognize this one from AngularJS times? Like, there's a really cool library there, which was built by Ken C. Dodds, or mainly maintained by him for a very long time. And it turns out the same library also exists for Angular now. Since about a year, and in the last half a year, they really improved it a lot. And so let's quickly have a look how that works, or how you could use it in your application. Now, NGX Formally mainly consists of two different kind of parts. Like, you have that core part, which has the whole core logic, like the whole form generation, validation stuff, and that kind of things. And then on this side, you have the different kind of UI themes which it supports, because that's obviously really important. As we have also heard today, like you have, for instance, the material approach, you can have Bootstrap, Prime, and G. It also supports even mobile parts, so you can see Ionic and NativeScript. So it has a variety of implementations. And of course, you could also implement your own. Like, that's something that's totally possible, and we'll probably very quickly see that as well. How does installation work? Actually, very simple, as you do normally with an external package. You can just install it over npm yarn, or it also supports the schematics, which we have heard today as well. Like, schematics not only help you to generate new code, but library authors actually have also the possibility to facilitate the installation, to make it easier for the users to install their library, so they can provide such install schematics, and that will then set up your project automatically. So you can just execute this command, and it will already work and have formally set up for you. Then obviously this will also be generated out of the schematics, otherwise you add it by hand. You basically register that root part and then your preferred UI library. In that case, I'm using Formally Material, but in general you could use one of those others which we have seen. Right, Formally Basics. Now let me do something which normally at like nearly 10 o'clock you shouldn't do. Switch to your code editor. So let me just quickly show you how this actually works. just that you get an idea. So for instance, let's first of all have a look here at the HTML part. And the HTML part is usually you have your normal reactive form. Okay, there's nothing strange here. Like you have the form group, which you have to instantiate, you have the submit event, you have the buttons, which you're totally free where to place them. The key part here is that Formly form in the middle. Like as you can probably imagine, when we installed Formly, we got that component. We can reference that in our template wherever we want to place it in our form. You could even mix it up, like you could have your plain normal reactive form and then add in that Formly form. And this is where the dynamic part basically happens. And so you have here three parts. You have that model, which is the actual data which you get from the server, like your data object. You have the fields, which is the configuration, which we'll see in a minute. And then you have the form itself, like you pass the reference in such that Formly internally can hook up validation and invalidate the form whenever it needs to. Great. So with that, actually the HTML part is done. So we can move that apart. We can now focus more on the part how we generate that configuration, which then creates the form automatically. So what I have done here is I've prepared here a static model that obviously in real world example would come from your server. You would do a normal HTTP fetch and you would get it. And then below here we have that fields which we have seen was bound before to our Formly component. So that was the model which we bound into our Formly component, that were the fields. Right now they're empty, which is also why here you don't see anything, right? So we could start map like that first name first. And so what you do is you create that kind of configuration. So you have that array where you pass in the fields which you want to render. And so usually you have the key, which is the property you want to address, for instance, first name. Then you have the type which you have to give him, which is type input, which is usually the case, most of the part. And then you have the template options and the label which you want to associate, for instance, first name in this case. Now if I save this, we should already see something happen on the site. As you can see, the field already gets rendered. It gets also data bound automatically. So Formly recognize the first name property of that above works. It should render an input type and it binds the data. Here below you see how it is being rendered. This is just a serialization of form.value, right, in my document, in my HTML part. And this is the model which we get from the server. This is basically that part above here. Now the interesting part is if I change this, of course you would expect the form value to change. What Formly does is it also changes the model, so it keeps both parts in sync. And this can be really a huge advantage sometimes when you have to do cross-validation and kind of things. All right, and so we could continue now doing the same for the age property, right? I just copy and paste this here. I add here the age, the label as well. We could now change this a bit and say, well, it is an input, but in theory what I could do here is I provide a type number, because actually I want to just that the user can provide here numbers and not strings or something. And you can already see how this here changed. Like I have these arrows now, I can move up and down with the keys, and I cannot type any kind of strings in there. So I just customized already the control. Now this is still very simple, of course. It gets more interesting here with these two. Like these are basically select boxes, right? Drop-down fields which I want to fill. And so again here, what I do is I bind here the nation ID. I say the type here is no more an input, but it's the select rather. Then you give it the template options, which will be my, let's say, a label nation. This is also the part where you would provide localization. If you have some localization to apply, you would just localize it and pass it into Formly directly here. And then the different part for the drop-down fields, of course, is that they need to have some options, right? And usually they are of the form like, let's say here, Italy, and value is 1. And then I could continue label Austria, and the value is 2. I save it, and now let's see, fingers crossed. Yeah, we get a drop-down field rendered. You can see the fields here. It already data binds to Italy, like when I provide here, for instance, an empty value. Let's say something like this, value null. Then you will see that it doesn't bind to the first one, but it binds to the Italy one, basically the correct one, because it knows that the nation ID is 1, and Italy actually corresponds to 1 because I added it down here. So it does already the data binding for me, and if I change it, you can see how it changes below as well. Now, of course, this is a dummy example. You wouldn't do something that in real code, right? You would basically fetch that from some service. And the nice thing here is, below here I have just a city service, which returns already observables, which could be HTTP calls, which I get from the server. So these are observables, so I could just do something like that, do get nations, and I get the nations in now. And it's already data bound, and I have here various options which directly come now from my server. And the nice thing is actually this is an observable. I can just pass it in. I don't have to subscribe first and serialize it, put it some local variable and then bind it, but I can just pass it in through. And Formally has this option for a lot of different kind of properties which you can set. Like it has really good observable support which you can provide out of the box. Cool. Same thing for the city ID. But now actually in the city ID, I would like to have that dependent on basically my nations above, right? So what I could do here is I could of course just do get cities, I guess, yeah. And so I get here the nation and the cities below. But I would actually like that these two cooperate, right? When I change the nation above, the cities below should automatically change and adapt themselves. And you can totally do that as well here. What you can have is so-called hooks. Hooks are a way to register into that component when it gets generated. You say, for instance, on init, whenever that component starts, I get here some field, which is such a formally field configuration. And from there, I can basically then go to the form control. And now we are back into reactive form land, right? So I can get here basically my nation ID, for instance. I can use the value changes. I can pipe that through and say, for instance, switch map that. I get here the city ID and go this through and call a city service and get me the cities which match that nation ID, or city and nation ID actually. So here we will get the nation ID, of course, and we get that in. I just subscribe to it. I get here all the cities. And then I can go here again to that field, which is actually that field configuration above. I can go to the template options, which you have seen above here, and I set them dynamically. I say options is equal to cities. There's a I'm missing an arrow on. Oh, right. Thanks. Perfect. You're still awake. I'm glad. Okay, so now if I change to Germany, it should actually switch to the German cities. I probably made a mistake here. Let me just do a quick hack and do what you... And so in this case, basically, you can see here, I'm getting here in the nation ID, and I'm getting the cities, and in theory it was perfectly right. Yeah, and it switches back in. So as you can see here, in the hooks, basically is the part where you can then connect different kind of fields together and basically then filter them and also apply visibilities. Another part here, which is really interesting, is these expression properties. Like as you know, for instance, whatever I want to do is when I change here that to empty, I want to disable a city because it doesn't make sense to select a city in that case. As you can see, setting up something like that is really simple. What you have to do is just disable and set the disabled property, but in a dynamic way. Like I don't go up here and just set here disabled is equal to true, but I rather say, well, use that expression properties which are evaluated at runtime whenever my model changes, set on the template options that disabled whenever the nation ID is not selected, right? And so in this case, I can already disable this part above here. Last part, which is interesting also, is these phone numbers. As you can see here, I have an array of different kind of subtypes which I need to generate, like these form arrays which you normally have in a reactive approach. And as you can see here below here, what I can do is I can add here multiple phone numbers. I can here just add a plus and add a new one and bind that in as well. And it will then basically be attached to my form value just automatically. How does that work? Well, what you can do informally is you can create such a repeat type. Now this is something I created, basically is a wrapper around a repeating section, which formally already gives you a base type which you can just extend and tell him how it should look like. Like what kind of buttons you want to have here besides, when you want to have the X, when you want to have the plus button, and so on. And then inside there, basically you have just a normal configuration as we had above. Like you have just a select box, you provide here the options. In this case, I provide them statically, or the number field just below. And this way you can hook the things up. And last but not least, obviously also validation. Like validation, you can just add here, for instance, a min validator. This should be 18. You can provide custom validation messages, or just at the global level say, whenever a min validator kicks in, I want to have that validation message. Whenever a required validator comes in, I want to have that validation message. And so, for instance, if I go here, like at 40, I will get here a validation message printed out directly. So it mostly focuses here on that form configuration part. Now let me switch back. I have all the slides here in between. I'll just jump over them. This is more for a reference material for you. These were basically the parts which I've shown in the demo. So these were all the parts which you have seen just in the demo, the lifecycle hooks. And what is missing is the custom form controls. Right? How do custom form controls look like? Because as you can imagine, of course, like we have heard today about design systems, and if I'm working in a corporate environment, I'm probably not having just Material or Bootstrap like the standard ones, but I'm having a customized UI theme for my company. And so in that case, if you can start from some material and extend it from there, it's more of an advantage because you can already use basically off the built-in Formally components, but you can totally create your own. For instance, what I did here is a simple example. I wanted to have an ng-select, which doesn't yet exist in Formally because it's like a custom component. I just took that ng-select component, which already exists online on GitHub. You can install it, and I've wrapped it basically. How does that work? What you have to do here is basically you have such a field type which you can inherit from Formally, like you import it from Formally. You create a new component which here wraps that ng-select component, or your own company internal component, whatever you have. Right? And then you can pass in the different kind of options. For instance, here this is an exploded version of the ng-select where you pass in multiple properties of that. And you can see that to.label or to.options or to.bindValue. That to stands for the template options which you have just seen. And since I'm inheriting here from field type, that can be passed in from Formally. So it's actually very easy to create your custom configuration. You can even add your custom properties because like a select box here has something like here a bind value, which another control might not have. So you can, Formally is flexible in that way, so it has a dynamic TypeScript type where you can just add properties on your role. Finally, once you have that, you register it, like you tell him, okay, that type which we have seen before, how should that be called? In this case, my autocomplete. And what component should Formally instantiate? It's this component. And so with that, you can create basically your own set of libraries and extend Formally as you want and as you need it inside your corporation. And here you see how you can use it. It's actually exactly the same as the select box, right? You don't see actually much difference from the first look. I just exchange the type with my own, and then I have an autocomplete type instead of a select box. So also changing this is quite easy, right? An important consideration here, so if you want to extend your own, if you want to extend Formally and create your own basically set of components, definitely go into the source code. Because as you have seen in the start of the presentation, there are those different UI frameworks. Just look how Formally has been implemented for those, like for Material, for Bootstrap, and use it for your own. Like you just copy that folder and adapt it for what you need in your own company. A final part also is the custom DSL. Like we have plenty of forms, like in the current application which we are developing, we have a lot of forms, but heavy forms, large forms, where users even have to scroll down. So what we did there is we didn't just use the plain Formally configuration, because as you can imagine, that gets really huge and also hard to maintain after a certain point. So we implemented somehow a custom domain-specific variant of that Formally. So we wrapped basically the configuration. What we did is, for instance, create a Formally service. It returns that famous Formally field config which we have seen, which is the original Formally config. But as you can see, the API is much more simple. Like here we will have an input, a config, which is our config. So we even like limit the original Formally config to what we usually need, so that it is easier for people to get started. And that could look like this, for instance. I could say for creating a new form here, a new Formally config, I just say this.formally, which is my service now, .input, and I just have to pass in those key and label. I don't have to have the nesting. and I can adjust it to what I need usually in my forms, right? You can even go further. For instance, if that city ID cell is needed in multiple places, you just can refactor it to something like that, right? It's, in the end, it's just a function which returns a formally config, right? So you can just compose it in that way. And that's also another way of how you could reuse parts of forms and recompose it, right? Also for testing, I'm currently experimenting around with it, because if you have a component which just returns your formally config, which actually has much of the logic inside there, like how fields are hidden, shown, based on other fields, based on inputs, I'm doing HTTP calls and so on, you can actually just create a generic component, fetch the configuration, load it into your test component, test it there, also maybe just 3-4 fields in isolation, and so that makes unit testing a lot easier as well. So in general, it helps that DSL to have that repetitive formally config, which over time you definitely get, because it's quite huge, because it's a general purpose. So you can just basically reuse it by tailoring it down into your own service and creating your custom configuration. Also, it's easier to handle potentially breaking changes, which you never know they come. The author really does an awesome job also providing now upgrade schematics for the latest version to do the migration when there are breaking changes. And there's much more. So there's much more stuff as well. Like we have seen, for instance, that repeats a bit, but you could actually create tabbed forms or forms with data tables or nested forms, flex-based layouts. Also that JSON-powered forms. With JSON-powered forms would actually be the part where the server returns how the form should look like, because the server actually knows how the model looks like and how basically the form should look like. So in some cases, we really need that flexibility where maybe your user can define what fields should be shown and what not. You could actually go into that direction and return the entire formally configuration from the server side. Definitely go to that URL down here. There are a lot of examples with stack blitzes linked, so you can actually go there, choose the example you want, open a stack blitz and play around with it, copy it over to your project and go ahead. So it did a really good job there in implementing that. Bram, he's a cool guy, you probably know him, he's very active in the community. He's also a huge formally addict. He now works at StackBlitz as well, so he's a huge contributor also to Formally and supporter, and he said basically he's using it whenever he can. And what I suggest is basically, to conclude the whole part, is there, once you have the initial setup, which might, depending on how you customize your company internal frameworks, UI library and so on it might take a bit more time initially, but once you have your building blocks, you're really fast to create forms, especially forms that have a lot of dependencies between them, especially due to that observable support. Because that observable support allows us to hide fields based on observables emitting and so on. So it gets really, really powerful in the end. I wouldn't suggest it necessarily if you have a lot of different kind of forms. Like if every form you have is really different to the others, like if you don't have kind of a standard flowing through your application, but maybe mixed with tables and stuff, then Formally might not help you that much. Like you can still use it, but you might not get that huge advantage of that speed which you might get out of it. Great, I would like to really thank that guy because he's the main brain behind NGX Formally. He's the core maintainer. And he does an awesome job. Like whenever you have some issues on GitHub, just open them up, like in a couple of hours, they're probably closed or with the solution provided. So he does an awesome job on that library. And if you have questions, of course, you can ask now or reach out later. Mike is already coming. Thank you.